Welcome back. Today we are diving into a really profound source document. It's titled 30 Different Worlds in Jhāna. And we're moving way past the basic introductions to meditation here.
Yeah, we are. We are looking directly at the underlying physics of consciousness today.
Exactly. Specifically, we're exploring the mechanics of meditative absorption, which is known as jhana, and how those internal states dictate the literal architecture of the 31 planes of existence.
Right, so if you want to know what actually happens to the biological and energetic body during advanced absorption, you are definitely in the right place.
Yeah, and how those micro shifts in awareness map onto this macroscopic cosmological model. So, okay, let's unpack this. The core premise we're dealing with right out of the gate is just a staggering proposition about the nature of the mind.
It really is.
This framework suggests that consciousness does not inherently require a physical apparatus to exist. It posits that the mind, under specific conditions of, well, extreme concentration, can completely isolate itself from biology and become its own self-sustaining engine.
Which is a radical departure from strictly materialist models of neuroscience, right? And it establishes the foundation for the entire cosmological architecture we're going to explore today.
Right.
What is particularly compelling about this approach is that it doesn't treat these states as abstract, disconnected mysticism. I mean, the model grounds these concepts right at the intersection of biology, physics, and the fundamental mechanics of awareness.
It's very grounded.
Exactly. It challenges us to observe the specific behaviors of consciousness when it is completely severed from sensory distraction. And to provide a structural roadmap for this process, the document relies on a highly specific visual representation, which is a lotus flower.
Yeah, the lotus diagram. I love this part.
But we have to look closely at the geometry of this image. The lotus is rooted in this dark, heavily patterned lower section, representing the density of the material world.
What the text classifies as the sensual realm.
Right. And as the stem rises, it transitions through a middle layer characterized by these dynamic, swirling lines. That represents the energetic refinement of the form realm.
Finally, the bloom reaches toward a glowing, multi-layered geometric dome defined by expanding, rippling circles of light. I mean, this isn't just art. It's a precise diagram mapping the trajectory of consciousness from baseline physical reality up into the absolute abstraction of the formless realm.
That visual of the lotus stem pulling nutrients from the dense mud and, transmuting them into that perfect abstract geometry at the top, it's the perfect anchor for this entire deep dive.
It really is.
But to understand how consciousness moves up that stem, we have to establish the baseline first. We have to look at the roots.
Right. Define how the mind operates in its default state.
Exactly. Which this framework categorizes as normal sense-sphere awareness, or kamavakara. And this is where the biological intersection gets incredibly precise.
Yes.
The model posits that our everyday waking awareness is inextricably linked to the circulatory system. Specifically, it relies on the iron content within circulating blood to generate continuous electromagnetic currents.
Which is a fascinating physical claim.
Right. The proposition here is that our baseline functioning consciousness is fundamentally an electromagnetic phenomenon.
Yeah.
And because it operates on this specific physical mechanism, the instant that blood flow ceases, normal awareness is completely severed.
It just cuts off.
Yeah. So think of normal sense-sphere awareness like a machine plugged into a wall outlet. It's an open-circuit system. It requires continuous, uninterrupted sensory input and a constant metabolic power source.
In this case, iron-rich blood pumped from the heart base.
Exactly, to maintain its electromagnetic field. If that metabolic engine halts, the circuit breaks and the awareness just collapses.
Precisely. Baseline human consciousness is a highly conditional state. It is entirely beholden to the flawless operation of the biological apparatus. But this is where the framework introduces the absolute pivot point of Jhānic consciousness.
This is the mind bender.
It is. It defines siddha, which we can understand as a discrete instance or a unit of consciousness, and explains that in a state of advanced absorption, the siddha can actually take itself as its primary object.
Which goes against everything we normally do.
Right, because in the open-circuit system of daily life, awareness is perpetually oriented outward. It's a reaction to a sound, a response to a visual stimulus, or, a cognitive reaction to a memory.
Always bouncing off things.
Exactly. However, upon entering jhana, the trajectory of awareness bends entirely inward. It focuses so acutely on its own fundamental nature that it collapses the open circuit into what the text describes as a self-sustaining seed.
It's self-sustaining seed.
What's What's fascinating here is the implication for the physics of the mind. Once consciousness establishes the self-sustaining loop, it fundamentally detaches from the biological power source.
Wow.
It no longer relies on the heart base or the electromagnetic current of the circulatory system. It generates its own internal stability. It becomes a closed, perfectly stable circuit of pure awareness, entirely independent of physical biology.
The idea of a mind powering itself simply by observing itself, it requires a complete paradigm shift. To contrast these two operational modes, the model utilizes the concept of the life continuum, the Bhavaga.
The Bhavaga, yes.
In our default open-circuit state, the life continuum is described as a fragmented stream of identical resultant siddhas. It's essentially a frantic process of point awarenesses desperately attempting to cohere around fleeting stimuli.
Just darting from one thing to the next.
Right. We are constantly chasing a visual cue, reacting to a physical sensation, darting away from an unpleasant thought. The cognitive load of that constant external tracking is immense. You can feel it when you're stressed.
You really can. It's exhausting.
But when observing heavenly or Jhānic awareness, the architecture of the Bhavaga shifts entirely. Instead of a frantic, fragmented stream, the continuum solidifies into these incredibly dense, tight knots of self-sustaining consciousness.
And the structural integrity of that knot changes the entire experience of reality.
How so?
Well, the fragmented stream of normal awareness is inherently exhausting because it lacks an internal anchor. It's a perpetual reaction engine. The self-sustaining seed, conversely, is perfectly anchored within itself.
It doesn't need to look outside.
Exactly. It doesn't seek out external data to validate its existence. And the structural stability is not merely a technique for deep meditation. Within this cosmological framework, it's the literal foundational physics required to sustain higher heavenly planes of existence.
If you just sit and consider the sheer cognitive relief of that state, a mind capable of generating its own gravitational center, completely unbattered by the chaotic influx of the physical world, it sounds completely unattainable for anyone living a normal life.
It really does sound like the exclusive domain of extreme ascetics living in caves.
Yeah, exactly. But the framework takes a very grounded turn right here. It explicitly clarifies that jhana is not restricted to mystics. In fact, it suggests that spontaneous, uncontrolled jhanic states are surprisingly common.
Yes.
It notes that many people first experience glimpses of this during childhood. Furthermore, it identifies specific categories of everyday people who naturally, albeit often unknowingly, cultivate these states.
Right, like profound abstract thinkers, dedicated artists.
Athletes who drop into the zone, highly trained musicians. The premise is that anyone engaged in habitual, intense, single-pointed thinking is momentarily operating within the Jhānic plane.
This is such a vital demystification of the process.
Yeah.
The framework uses these practical examples to illustrate the underlying mechanics of absorption.
Right.
Think about it. When a grandmaster is visualizing a chessboard or a musician is executing a really complex symphony, what is neurologically and phenomenologically occurring?
They're locked in.
In those moments of absolute singular focus, their consciousness ceases its frantic, fragmented tracking. The cognitive open circuit temporarily closes.
The mind of the musician structurally merges with the auditory object.
Yes, and the mind of the athlete merges seamlessly with the kinesthetic action. For a brief, often uncontrolled duration, awareness bends inward and stabilizes on its object, spontaneously generating that self-sustaining knot. They achieve the exact structural architecture of jhana, even if they lack the esoteric vocabulary to label it as such.
It is that profound flow state where your perception of time completely distorts. And somatic awareness, like the feeling of having a body, being hungry, or having a sore back, it entirely drops away until the absorption breaks.
Absolutely.
But the framework identifies a very specific, absolute barrier to achieving or maintaining this state. It introduces the concept of vyapa, which means ill will.
This is a crucial rule.
And the rule is uncompromising.
Yeah.
Both Jhānic consciousness and the higher beings referred to as devas or angels absolutely cannot tolerate the presence of ill will under any circumstances.
If we look at the cosmological physics presented here, ill will isn't framed as a mere moral failing or just an ethical lapse.
Right, it's not about being a bad person.
Exactly. It is a structural impossibility within this architecture. Anger, malice, intense frustration, they are fundamentally destabilizing energetic forces.
Like blowing up the knot.
Literally. If we return to the definition of jhana as a tightly runed, perfectly unified knot of consciousness, ill will acts as an explosive counterforce. The model indicates that the introduction of ill will literally shatters the citta. It blows apart the self-sustaining seed.
Yep.
You simply cannot maintain a cognitive architecture that is perfectly merged with an object while simultaneously generating a state of violent rejection toward another object, which is essentially the functional definition of anger.
That makes total sense.
And this concept is then scaled up to the macro level, suggesting that ill will is instantly lethal to angels or divas.
Instant death for an angel.
Right. Their entire plane of existence, their actual biological and energetic makeup, is constructed from these stabilized, non-combative Jhānic knots. Introducing malice into that system is the equivalent of introducing antimatter. It results in instantaneous structural collapse.
That reframes the entire concept of emotional regulation for me. It is not about being good. It is about maintaining structural integrity.
Exactly.
I mean, think about any flow state you have ever experienced. If you're deeply immersed in writing code or painting or performing a complex physical task, and you make a critical error that triggers genuine anger toward yourself or the process, what happens?
The flow state evaporates in a microsecond.
You are violently yanked back into your heavy, localized, frustrated physical body. The ill will literally shattered the concentration knot.
That's a perfect everyday example of it.
Now, if an individual successfully navigates past that barrier of ill will and stabilizes that concentration intentionally, the framework details a profound physiological cascade. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The body shutdown phase.
Yes. When the mind fully merges with its object and sustains the Jhānic seed, the body initiates a systemic shutdown. The conditioned reliance on external stimuli is forgotten, and the mind effectively powers down the physical apparatus.
The adrenaline just stops.
The adrenal response is completely halted. The background sympathetic nervous system tone, which dictates our baseline anxiety, our muscle tension, our constant readiness for action, it drops to zero.
Which is incredible to think about.
The physical body is plunged into a state of physiological rest that mirrors deep sleep, yet the consciousness remains acutely, intensely awake.
That complete collapse of sympathetic tone is the critical biological marker of advanced absorption. The sympathetic nervous system is our evolutionary tether to the external world.
The threat detection engine.
Exactly. It constantly demands our attention. When absorption is achieved, the mind ceases to process external sensory data, meaning the brain stops broadcasting those survival-oriented stress signals.
Everything slows down.
The heart rate slows dramatically, blood pressure equalizes at a lower baseline, and the muscular system achieves absolute flaccidity. This state surpasses the restorative capacity of deep non-REM sleep, precisely because the chaotic, involuntary cognitive processing of dream states is also completely absent.
The mind is unified, and the body is finally allowed to exist without the burden of constant readiness. And here is where the framework applies this strict neurobiological lens to a concept heavily shrouded in mysticism. It provides a purely physiological explanation for Kundalini.
I love how grounded this text is.
It's amazing.
Oh.
In modern spiritual parlance, Kundalini is almost exclusively discussed as a coiled, mystical serpent energy resting at the base of the spine that violently shoots up through the chakras into the brain.
Magic serpent energy, basically.
Right. But this document strips away the metaphor entirely. It posits that what practitioners identify as Kundalini is simply the conscious somatic awareness of that progressive relaxation of the sympathetic tone.
It's a physiological event.
As the fight-or-flight system powers down, there's a massive consequential increase in blood flow to the pelvic and abdominal organs. The profound sensation of heat, pooling energy, and vascular dilation in the lower abdomen. The model argues this is exactly what is being felt.
It completely reframes Eastern mysticism through a Western neurobiological lens.
If the serpent energy is just blood pooling due to a drop in sympathetic tone, it implies that centuries of mystical metaphors were actually just ancient practitioners doing their best to describe autonomic nervous system regulation.
It's a rigorously grounded interpretation that translates esoteric phenomenological experiences into observable biological events. It doesn't diminish the profundity of the experience at all.
No, it just makes it real.
Exactly. It demystifies the mechanics. The practitioner is observing the literal vascular shifting of blood volume as the organism's evolutionary emergency protocols are deactivated.
Right.
But the framework goes far beyond just the physiological shifts. It maps the experiential progression of the mind once this physical quietude is achieved.
What happens to the mind?
Well, with the chaotic inputs of the senses nullified, the mind enters a space where the dominant functioning level of consciousness aligns with metta.
Which is characterized as pure, boundless love or loving kindness. And it is crucial to understand why it manifests as love. It's not an emotional byproduct or some forced sentimentality. The model explains that because the Sikha has turned completely inward, taking itself as the object, it is directly observing the fundamental structure of the self.
It's looking right at the core.
At that level of unified, highly concentrated observation, the cognitive boundary between subject and object, or self and other, simply cannot be sustained.
The architecture of separation dissolves.
And the natural, inevitable result of those boundaries collapsing is a profound structural state of metta. There is no external other to defend against, and therefore no mechanism for fear or hostility.
It's structural love.
Exactly. This internal realization of non-separation manifests physically, first as viti, which translates to an intense bodily zest, rapture, or vibrating energetic sensation. And as the concentration stabilizes further, that rapture refines into sukha, which is characterized as pure, unadulterated, frictionless bliss.
That progression from piti to sukha is really a progression from turbulence to absolute equilibrium. We can conceptualize piti, the rapture, almost as the energetic friction of the biological nervous system attempting to process this massive, unaccustomed shift in cognitive focus.
So it's like the body buzzing as it adjusts.
Exactly. The intensity of piti can be overwhelmingly physical, but as the mind settles deeper into the stability of the Jhānic knot, that somatic friction entirely dissipates.
And then comes sukha.
What remains is sukha, the smooth, perfectly frictionless bliss of unified awareness. And within this cosmological model, these specific internal states and an entity's ability to master them are not merely fleeting meditative experiences.
They are the actual blueprints.
Yes, they are the exact blueprints that construct the broader cosmos. This leads us to the framework's mapping of the 31 distinct realms of existence.
We're finally getting to the map.
The core principle here is that these realms are not external locations governed by arbitrary judgment. They are the direct, naturally corresponding environments generated by specific mental states.
The mastery, or the complete absence of mastery over one's own consciousness, dictates the precise dimensional plane where that consciousness will experience its subsequent reality.
It operates entirely on the physics of resonance. Consciousness naturally gravitates to the realm that perfectly matches its energetic and psychological density.
Let's examine this cosmological architecture, starting from the densest layer, the central realm, or Kamaloka. The absolute bottom of this hierarchy comprises the woeful realms, levels 1 through 4.
The dark roots of the lotus.
Right. These planes are entirely dictated by unwholesome, uncontrolled mental states. Level 1 is hell. But the model introduces a crucial nuance here. It is a realm of intense, agonizing suffering, but it is strictly impermanent.
It's not eternal damnation.
Exactly. It's a localized karmic state that is eventually exhausted once the specific energetic density of that unwholesome action burns out.
Right.
Level 2 is the animal realm, which is driven by baseline survival instincts, territoriality, and a lack of complex moral agency.
Pure instinct.
Level 3 is incredibly psychologically complex. It's the realm of hungry ghosts. Beings here are tethered by wrong views and absence of virtue and are defined by perpetual, insatiable craving. They possess massive desires but lack any physical or energetic mechanism to fulfill them.
Always wanting, never getting.
And level 4 is the realm of the Asuras, a plane defined entirely by constant, zero-sum conflict, jealousy, and militaristic competition.
If we analyze levels 1 through 4, we see that these woeful realms map perfectly onto the most destructive pathologies of the human mind. They are externalized realities, built from internal psychological failures.
It's mirror.
Exactly. When an individual is entirely consumed by blind, destructive rage, their cognitive architecture is temporarily matching the frequency of level 1.
Hell.
Right. When human behavior regresses purely to base appetites and territorial aggression, it aligns with the frequency of level 2, the animal realm.
What about the hungry ghosts?
The hungry ghost realm of level 3 is perhaps the most relevant to modern human psychology. It is the precise cosmological equivalent of the addiction loop.
Wow.
A mind consumed by a substance, a behavioral addiction, or even endless consumerism, always wanting, never satisfied, perpetually hollow, is actively generating the architecture of a hungry ghost.
That's haunting.
And when individuals or societies lock into bitter, paranoid rivalries where success is only defined by another's destruction, they're operating within the Asura state of level 4. The cosmological map is simply the psychological landscape writ large.
It is a clinical, almost terrifyingly precise mapping of human dysfunction. But ascending from those dense states The framework brings us into the blissful sensual realms, which are levels 5 through 11.
Moving up the stem.
Right. Level 5 is the human realm. And the framework does not treat humanity as a biological default. It specifically categorizes human birth as requiring a highly specific equilibrium of virtue and wisdom, designating it a rare and precious birth opportunity.
It's a delicate balance.
It really is.
Yeah.
It suggests that achieving the exact balance of suffering required to motivate growth, combined with enough cognitive freedom to actually pursue it, is an incredibly delicate karmic tightrope. Above humanity, levels 6 through 11 comprise the various Teva realms. These are planes of immense creative power and refined sensual pleasure, and access to them is dictated by the cultivation of 10 specific wholesome actions.
Here, the physics of the system integrate perfectly with our earlier analysis. Recall the absolute structural impossibility of ill will existing within the architecture of a diva.
Right, because it blows up the knot.
Exactly. This aligns flawlessly with the requirement of rigorous, wholesome actions to access level 6 through 11. The beings in these planes exist in a reality where malice, greed, and cruelty have no structural integrity. They cannot physically manifest in that environment.
The environment literally won't allow it.
Their reality is built entirely from the stabilized frequencies of generosity, profound kindness, and flawless ethical conduct. If a human consciousness consistently cultivates those precise states, refining its own energetic density, it naturally becomes resonant with the frequencies of those higher sensual realms.
You essentially tune your cognitive apparatus to the frequency of absolute kindness, and eventually the environment you inhabit must match that frequency.
That's the physics of it.
However, even the highest divas are still operating within the sensual realm. They possess sensory organs, no matter how refined, and they interact with external phenomena. The framework then initiates a massive paradigm shift, crossing a boundary into the form realm, or Rupa Loka.
Now we are getting into the really abstract architecture.
Yes, this encompasses levels 12 through 27. These are the fine material worlds. They are described as perfect mental landscapes. They retain subtle concepts of geometry, light, and form, but they are constructed entirely out of deep meditative concentration.
Worlds built entirely out of thought.
Literally built out of Jhānic stability. The internal breakdown of these levels is fascinating. Levels 12 to 14 correspond directly to the mastery with the first jhana, serving as the realms of the great Brahmas and their ministers. Levels 15 to 17 correspond to the second jhana, defined by a state of radiant existence. Levels 18 to 21 align with the third jhana, representing realms of varying degrees of profound, unshakable jhanic bliss inhabited by the fruitful divas.
What we are observing in the form realm is the literal macroscopic manifestation of those self-sustaining jhanic seeds.
How does that work in practice?
Well, when a practitioner masters the first jhana, their mind utilizes specific cognitive factors, namely applied and sustained thought, to maintain the absorption. Upon the transition of rebirth, their entire subsequent reality is constructed exclusively from those specific mental factors.
So the thoughts build the world.
It is a world of pure, subtle form generated by thought. As the practitioner masters deeper layers of jhana, for instance, dropping the heavy effort of applied thought to enter the second jhana, or dropping the turbulent friction of rapture to enter the third, the corresponding cosmological realms become increasingly subtle.
Increasingly radiant.
And exponentially more blissful. The external environment in the form realm is nothing more than the perfect, mirrored reflection of the stabilized, unified siddha.
Okay, but sitting right in the middle of this incredibly elegant, radiant progression of mental refinement, the framework presents what has to be the most bizarre anomaly in the entire system.
Level 22.
Yes, level 22. It is designated as the realm of unconscious beings. The text plainly states the conditions. Only body present, no mind. How does a realm fundamentally exist where entities possess physical or fine material bodies, but absolutely zero consciousness?
It's a paradox.
So we have a realm of biological stasis with zero subjective experience. Medically speaking, that sounds analogous to a persistent vegetative state on a planetary scale.
Basically, yes.
But the framework presents it as a specific karmic outcome of advanced meditation. Does the architecture view this state as a spiritual success, or is this a massive evolutionary dead end?
Oh, it is entirely a spiritual dead end.
Yeah.
And it illustrates the profound danger of misdirected concentration.
How does a consciousness orchestrate its own extinction while maintaining the biological form?
It occurs through a highly specific, paradoxical meditative technique. The practitioner incorrectly identifies consciousness itself, the mere act of perceiving as the ultimate source of all suffering.
Oh, so they blame the mind itself.
Right. Instead of seeking to liberate the mind, they actively utilize immense willpower to suppress and eventually halt the cognitive process entirely while maintaining the vital life force of the body. They achieve a temporary cessation of mental activity.
And the universe just grants that wish.
The karmic physics of the system respond to this exact intention. Upon rebirth, the result is a lifespan in level 22, a realm where the physical form exists in perfect, pristine stasis, completely devoid of any subjective experience, thought, or perception.
That is wild.
It is a striking, terrifying example of how precisely the cosmological architecture grants exactly what the mind focuses on. If your ultimate goal is the complete suppression of the mind, the universe accommodates you with a mindless realm.
But they don't stay there forever, do they?
No, because ignorance has not been uprooted through insight. Once that immense karmic momentum of suppression exhausts itself, the being falls right back into the lower planes of samsara.
That is a chilling demonstration of the neutrality of concentration. Moving past that anomaly, we arrive at the apex of the form realms. Levels 23 through 27 are categorized as the pure abodes.
The highest forms of subtle matter.
And there is a massive restriction placed on these specific planes. They are strictly accessible only to non-returners and arahants. These are beings who have not only achieved mastery of the fourth jhana, but are also profoundly advanced on the path of insight and total liberation.
They've broken the tethers.
Right. They have severed the fetters tying them to the sensual world, and they will never return to the lower, denser realms.
If we connect this progression to the larger cosmological architecture, the correlation is undeniable. There is a precise one-to-one relationship between the depth of meditative mastery, from the turbulence of the first jhana, all the way to the absolute equanimity of the fourth, and the refinement of the resulting dimensional existence.
The cleaner the mind, the higher the realm.
Exactly. The cleaner the mind becomes, the fewer cognitive factors it relies upon to maintain its stability, the higher and more refined the corresponding realm. The pure abodes represent the absolute pinnacle of conditioned existence that still retains any recognizable concept of subtle form or spatial geometry.
But even the subtlest form, eventually, reveals itself as a structural limitation. Which brings us to the absolute edge of the map, the top of the lotus reaching into the void.
The formless realm.
We cross into the Arupa Loka, comprising levels 28 through 31. The framework describes these realms as strange, incredibly solipsistic states of existence. And frankly, that is an understatement.
It's hard to even conceptualize.
There's absolutely nothing physical or spatial here. There is only pure abstracted mind. There is no vision, no auditory perception, no fine material bodies. Zero concepts relying on materiality exist here.
None.
The sequential progression through these four formless jhanas is an exercise in extreme subtraction that challenges the very limits of conceptual thought. Let's analyze the progression. Level 28 is the first formless jhana, the realm of infinite space. The framework notes that this is the absolute final boundary where concepts like space, extent, or even the idea of a localized being still apply.
It's just endless volume.
Right. Then level 29 is the second formless jhana, the realm of infinite consciousness. Here, the mind realizes that the infinite space it was perceiving is actually just an extension of its own awareness, so it drops the concept of space entirely.
The text explicitly states that at this level, the illusion of individuation collapses. All beings are one and none. The boundary defining me versus not me is entirely eradicated.
It is a process of abandoning increasingly subtle containers.
Exactly. In level 28, you realize that any subtle physical form is a limitation, so you drop form and rest your awareness entirely on the infinite container itself, the concept of endless space.
But then you realize that's a container, too.
Yes. As concentration deepens, you realize that even holding the concept of space requires cognitive effort. So in level 29, you recognize that the space is merely a projection of your own boundless mind. You drop the container of space and rest purely in infinite consciousness.
But then it pushes even further into a genuine philosophical paradox. Level 30 is the third formless jhana, the realm of nothingness. Here, the consciousness drops even the concept of its own infinite nature, resting in a state of complete void.
The absolute void.
But wait, if an entity is actively aware of nothingness, isn't that awareness still a something? How does the cosmological architecture resolve the paradox of a consciousness actively perceiving an absolute void without turning the void into an object?
That is the exact paradox that propels the mind to the final level. In level 30, the mind takes the absence of consciousness as its object. It is aware of the lack of anything to be aware of.
Which is still an awareness.
Right. As you pointed out, the subtle flaw remains. The act of perceiving nothingness still requires a perceiver. It is still a dualistic state, however infinitesimally subtle.
So what's the next step?
Recognizing this ultimate limitation, the mind takes the final step in conditioned reality to level 31, the fourth formless jhana. This is called neither perception nor non-perception.
That is a mouthful.
In this state, the consciousness refines itself to such a staggering degree that it exists on the absolute knife edge of reality. The cognitive activity is so impossibly faint that you cannot accurately state that the being is perceiving anything because the object of nothingness has been dropped.
But they aren't dead.
No, you also cannot state that they are completely unconscious because the biological suppression of level 22 is not occurring. It is the absolute limit of what mind can achieve while still remaining within the cycle of conditioned existence.
It's the absolute edge.
And tragically, the framework notes that beings existing in this state are entirely unable to perceive the Dhamma. Their awareness is so abstracted and withdrawn that they cannot interact with or learn from enlightened teachings.
They have essentially painted themselves into the most magnificent, abstract, cosmic corner possible.
That is exactly what it is.
But the framework details a phenomenon achievable within these highest formless realms. It sounds like pure science fiction. It's absolute temporal stasis.
This part is mind-blowing.
It describes how awareness can be completely frozen, stepping entirely outside the flow of relative time for mind-blowing periods. We're not talking about millennia. We're talking about cosmic timescales spanning the birth and death of universes.
The implications for the physics of consciousness here are staggering. The model states that advanced masters who seek this state of true oblivion receive the absolute maximum capability that conditional reality can offer.
How does it work?
By entering this temporal stasis, a consciousness can literally suspend itself beyond the physical extinction, the heat death, of the entire current universe.
Surviving the end of the universe just by meditating.
Yes. They can wait out the total dissolution of matter and spatial dimension in a state of absolute suspended mental animation, only to return to active participation in samsara, the cycle of rebirth, in a completely new, distant universe once the physical conditions reform. They survive the death of objective reality simply by refusing to participate in the flow of time.
It is the ultimate cosmic survival bunker.
Yeah.
Just folding your cognitive architecture into such a tight, abstract knot that the universe itself collapsing around you doesn't even register on your awareness.
Incredible.
But, and this is the massive pivot of the entire document, after laying out all of this unimaginable majesty, after explaining how to build fine material heavens and survive the heat death of reality, the framework drops a severe, uncompromising warning.
A massive red flag.
Jhāna, in all its forms, is a trap. The document explicitly warns that jhānic absorption is highly dangerously addictive.
It is categorized as arguably the most dangerous trap on the spiritual path, precisely because it mimics the ultimate goal so effectively.
Why is it so addictive?
Because, as we established, the architecture of jhana is defined by the complete absence of sympathetic nervous system stress, combined with profound rapture and frictionless unified bliss.
Feels amazing.
It feels exponentially superior to the chaotic, painful, fragmented reality of the sensual world. Therefore, it easily becomes the ultimate psychological refuge.
You just want to stay there.
Exactly. A practitioner can achieve this state and simply decide to build a permanent home there, retreating into their self-generated bliss bubble every time the reality of the external world becomes abrasive.
Hiding from your problem.
Right. And the acute danger is that this completely sidetracks the practitioner from the actual goal of total liberation. The framework is entirely uncompromising on this point. Jhānic consciousness, even the temporal stasis of level 31, is still fundamentally normal awareness.
It's just highly polished.
Very highly developed awareness, but it remains a conditioned state. It relies on causes and conditions, and therefore it will eventually exhaust itself and end. It is not enlightenment.
It's like building the most luxurious, impenetrable, radiantly beautiful mansion imaginable, but failing to realize you built it inside the walls of a maximum security prison. It's beautiful, but you are still inherently trapped.
That is a perfect analogy.
And the framework exposes another massive loophole regarding this technology of the mind. It notes that achieving deep jhana can bestow profound psychic or energetic abilities referred to as abhinya.
Yes, the psychic powers.
But the explicit expert advice regarding these abilities: do not pursue them. The text strictly warns that pursuing these powers almost universally leads to disastrous karmic outcomes.
Which surprises a lot of people.
Right, because the mechanics of concentration can be developed entirely independent of moral training.
Right.
A person with terrible ethical foundations, someone exhibiting actively destructive and shoddy behavior, can technically still learn the mechanics of concentrating their mind.
Yes.
They could achieve jhānic bliss and use that stabilized state as a psychological shelter from the natural consequences of their own actions.
That is the crux of the warning, and it requires a mature understanding of what concentration actually is. Concentration is morally neutral. It is simply a technology of the mind.
Like a tool.
Exactly. In the same way that a laser can be used by a surgeon to excise a tumor or by a weaponized drone to cause destruction, Jhānic concentration simply amplifies whatever foundational psychology the meditator brings to the cushion.
So if you're a bad person with great concentration,
If a practitioner lacks the sharp blade of insight, if they lack a foundation of rigorous moral clarity and an understanding of impermanence, developing immense concentration or unlocking energetic abilities merely inflates the ego to a cosmic scale.
Wow.
They might successfully generate the architecture to be reborn as a magnificent Brahma in the form realms, but eventually that specific karmic momentum will exhaust itself.
and what happens then?
Because they haven't actually uprooted their fundamental ignorance or the illusion of the self, they will inevitably plummet right back down to the lower sensual realms, perhaps even the woeful ones.
So what does this all mean? How do we reconcile the fact that this profound framework spends so much time painstakingly detailing these unimaginably beautiful states of absorption,
Right.
mapping out 31 distinct realms of cosmic geometry and formless voids, only to turn around and declare that mastering all of it is fundamentally a trap?
We reconcile it by clearly defining the difference between a vehicle and a destination.
Okay.
Without the application of insight, which is the direct, penetrating understanding of impermanence, the unsatisfactoriness of conditioned reality, and the fundamental absence of a permanent self, Jhāna only leads to a more comfortable rebirth within the endless cycle.
It's just a nicer cage.
It merely upgrades your seating arrangement on the Titanic. It moves you from a terrible neighborhood in Sassara to an exclusive gated community. But the ultimate destination of this entire philosophical framework isn't finding a better realm to exist in. The ultimate destination is breaking the mechanism of the cycle entirely.
And that brings us to the final, ultimate paradigm shift described in the document. The shift from mundane Jhānic siddha, which includes even those universe-surviving formless states, to what is defined as transcendental awareness.
The real goal.
Yes. The framework categorizes this as path and fruit siddha. And the mechanics required to make this leap are incredibly specific. You cannot just use brute force concentration to get there. The siddha has to fundamentally change its target.
Right.
It must take nirvana itself, the unconditioned reality, as its object. To execute this, the document explains that the three wholesome roots of consciousness must lock together and function perfectly as a single, unified cognitive unit.
Those three roots are non-hatred, non-greed, and non-illusion.
Also known as a dosa, aloha, and a moha. Only when those three factors synchronize flawlessly does the mind possess the precise architecture necessary to make the leap into transcendental awareness.
And we must define exactly what that transcendental awareness entails.
Please do.
It is defined by the total permanent eradication of the illusion of a permanent self. Let's look at the contrast. In mundane jhana, the ego or the self is quieted, it is heavily suppressed, and it is temporarily forgotten in the frictionless bliss of concentration.
But it's still hiding in the background.
Exactly. The underlying architecture of me still exists. In transcendental awareness, the very psychological infrastructure that generates the illusion of a permanent, localized self is permanently dismantled. It cannot be reassembled.
The psychological relief described in the framework when this dismantling occurs is absolute. Just think about the daily psychological tortures of the human experience.
They are exhausting.
The document lists them clearly. Deep-seated anxiety, pervasive fear, agonizing guilt, shame, worry, violent hate, jealousy, lust, envy, and the baseline delusion of separation. In the moment of transcendental awareness, all of those states are instantly, permanently eradicated.
Oof, gone.
And the logic is flawless. Why did they disappear? Because every single one of those painful emotions structurally requires a self to defend or a self to acquire things for.
Right.
If the core inner architecture that guards a permanent self is destroyed, anxiety has no surface area to stick to. Guilt has no central owner. It is the ultimate logical definition of liberation.
It is, and crucially, it is not merely a subjective mental shift. The framework notes observable physiological markers for this ultimate state.
Oh, the body changes again.
Yes. The sympathetic tone, that baseline survival anxiety we discussed earlier, collapses completely and permanently.
Permanently.
The heart rate slows dramatically, and the document even notes an observable shift where the skin takes on a reddish or bluish hue. This indicates a profound, permanent change in systemic oxygenation and blood flow during that peak momentary realization of the unconditioned.
It is a total reboot of the biological and psychological organism.
Completely.
Now, the framework provides a brief but vital distinction regarding how different classes of liberated beings experience this reality.
Yeah.
It differentiates between a Buddha and an arahant.
Right. Both are liberated, but there's a difference.
A Buddha is described as possessing an architecture that exists almost entirely in this continuous transcendental awareness. They only step down from it, utilizing what the framework calls functional sikha, when they specifically need to vocalize, teach, or interact with the physical logistics of the sensual world.
They basically live in it.
Exactly. An arahant, who is also fully and completely liberated from the cycle, experiences this transcendental state initially as a discrete moment of fruition. While their liberation is complete, they retain certain karmic residues.
Not active mental defilements or ignorances.
Right, just the lingering physical and energetic momentums of past actions that subtly differentiate their daily operational experience from the absolute, perfected continuity of a Buddha.
It is incredible how granular and precise the distinctions are regarding the mechanics of enlightenment.
It really is.
Yeah.
But after guiding us through this immense, overwhelming architecture, from the electromagnetic currents in our blood, up through the temporal stasis of the formless voids, and finally to the ultimate leap into the unconditioned reality of nirvana, the document concludes with what has to be the most comforting, grounding reassurance possible.
I love this part.
It explicitly states, advanced development is not essential to the path, so don't stress if you find tranquility meditation difficult.
That caveat is a stroke of profound pedagogical wisdom.
It's like a huge sigh of relief.
It is the architect of the system saying, I have just meticulously detailed the absolute outer limits of cosmological physics and what the concentrated mind is capable of achieving, but you do not actually need to build a rocket ship to the pure abodes, and you do not need to learn how to survive the heat death of the universe in a formless void to be free.
You don't need any of that.
Liberation through insight, the act of simply observing the truth of reality clearly, right here, right now, in the midst of normal sense-sphere awareness, is the true, singular goal. Jhāna is a powerful, incredibly beautiful vehicle that can aid the process by stabilizing the mind, but it is not the only vehicle capable of traveling the road to freedom.
What a phenomenal journey this has been. We started by examining how our baseline everyday mind operates essentially as an open-circuit electromagnet powered by the iron in our blood.
It's been a massive arc.
We discovered that dropping into the zone during a mundane hobby is structurally identical to tasting the architecture of the heavenly realms. We mapped the 31 planes of the cosmos, seeing how human pathologies build the woeful realms of hungry ghosts, while wholesome states literally construct the radiant geometry of the Deva and form realms.
Right.
We peered into the bizarre alien voids of the formless planes, where consciousness subtracts itself into near nothingness. And finally, we saw that true, lasting freedom is not found by utilizing concentration to escape to a higher, better realm.
No, it isn't.
It's found by utilizing insight to completely eradicate the illusion of the self through transcendental awareness.
It stands as one of the most rigorous, profound maps of human potential ever devised. And I believe the most vital takeaway for you listening to this right now is that whether your goal is the ultimate eradication of suffering, or simply finding a sustainable pocket of peace in a frantic, demanding world, understanding the mechanics of your own awareness is incredibly empowering.
It really changes everything.
Just possessing the knowledge that your consciousness is not entirely beholden to biological stress, that it has the inherent structural capability to fold inward, to sever the external noise, and to generate its own self-sustaining stability is a tool that changes how you interact with reality.
It fundamentally rewrites your relationship with your own chaotic thoughts.
And as we close this deep dive, I want to leave you with a completely different implication to consider, building on the biological reality of this framework.
Okay, let's hear it.
We established that normal, everyday awareness relies heavily on the sympathetic nervous system, our evolutionary fight-or-flight mechanism, to keep us tethered to the sensual realm, constantly scanning for threats and ensuring physical survival.
Right.
But this cosmological architecture explicitly shows that higher states of consciousness and ultimate liberation itself demand the complete collapse and abandonment of that survival network.
So what does that mean for us?
So consider this. What does that imply about human evolution? Are our biological survival instincts the exact neurochemical mechanisms that kept our species alive for millennia actually the very things actively preventing our psychological and spiritual evolution?
Oh, wow.
Are we fundamentally trapped in the sensual realm not by a lack of morality, but by the overwhelming success of our own biology?
That is a staggering thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.